Hello, welcome to this week's screencast for people in the natural environment. And the theme of this week's mini lecture is understanding environmental behaviour. So the way that this links to the theme from last week, which was around environmental standpoints, following on from the idea of environmental stewardship and changing the way that we relate to the natural environment. Um, So one of the ways in which we kind of understand our relationship with the natural environment would be to do with how we actually engage with it in physical form, which is kind of the things that we've been thinking about so far. But one of the biggest impacts that we have as human beings on the natural environment is the way that we consume it as a resource. So while we are thinking about changing this dynamic between people and nature, we can't really ignore the fact that a lot of that relationship happens in a kind of an indirect way in terms of the way that we consume natural resources and energy and all the things that have a direct impact upon the natural environment, but don't feel like engaging with the natural environment. So recognizing this relationship requires a kind of paradigm shift. So if we're stuck in this idea that the only way that we relate to nature is when we visit it or when we're in it, and we don't think about how our everyday behaviours impact upon it as well, we're kind of missing the main point really. So we have to change our mindset, not only around the way that we look at nature, the way that we engage in it, the way that we understand its benefits, but also the way that we consume it as a resource. And this is a big area of my research interest is to do with understanding the kind of the drivers of the way that we behave and consume, and understanding the complexity of that in order to think about how we can change it. So I'm an applied researcher, so I'm really interested not only in understanding things from a theoretical perspective, but how they impact upon the way that we actually live our lives. So I'm going to take you into a little bit of theory for part of the screencast, because I think it's really important to understand that there is actually an awful lot of work that goes into understanding human behaviour, and it's kind of studied extensively as a kind of discipline all on its own. So a lot of the way in which we assume that we behave is based around the theories of planned behaviour, which is actually a set of ideas and theories that kind of come from psychology, which is traditionally the discipline that's kind of focused on understanding human behaviour. Um, so theories of planned behaviour are quite an old theoretical area now, and what they do is they kind of say that the way in which we actually end up behaving is based upon a combination of our attitudes, what we think of as normal and achievable, and those things kind of work together in our head to inform our behavioural intention, so what we intend to do, which then goes on to actually shape and inform our actual behaviour, what we do. And that seems to make sense. That resonates with people. They think, yeah, that's what's going on here. I have some ideas and beliefs. I think about what I want to do, and then I do it. So it kind of resonates with us on a deep level, and so it makes sense to us. What's interesting about this from a kind of environmental behaviours perspective is that this set of theories has really informed an awful lot of the interventions and programs and policies around trying to change people's environmental behaviour. So there's an assumption that sits underneath a lot of those programs and interventions, which is that if you want to change the way that people behave, then what you actually have to do is focus on changing their attitudes, and changing the way that they think about the environment. And then if you can do that and you can re-educate people, that will have an influence upon their behaviour. But taking this a little bit further, and I'm sorry if my video is obscuring part of the text there, but the top of this diagram here says influences on and of consumer behaviour. So there are a lot of theory. You can go away and explore this in a lot of depth, focusing on understanding the drives of human behaviour. But it can be kind of summarised. The theories of planned behaviour can be summarised nicely as the ABC model. So attitude, behaviour and choice. And these are the kind of ideas and the words and the terminology that influence an awful lot of programs and interventions around environmental behaviour. The argument goes historically then that if you want to change outcomes, you change people's attitudes in order that they make better choices. So the behaviour in this way is kind of characterised by changing people's choices and the way that they make choices and the things that influence their choices. And a lot of these ideas that I'll be talking about today are attributed to a sociologist called Elizabeth Shove. You can go and read, and the references are at the end of the presentation. So one of the things I would like you to think about here, I'm going to try and move myself down here for a moment so you can see this poster. So one of the things I'd like you to go away and think about after this presentation really is how successful do you think that campaigns and awareness raising kind of interventions are at actually changing behaviour? Included a poster here from obviously from the Second World War. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. So this is a propaganda poster of the Second World War. A lot of those ideas there, come from these theories of planned behaviour, that you actually change the way that people think and feel about their activities and their beliefs, and from that you'll start to change people's behaviours. So campaigning, persuasion, information posters and campaigns like that are a really traditional way of trying to influence and change people's behaviour. So I'll stay down here for this bit. I would like to just discuss for a moment the problematic nature of this issue of choice, though, because whilst we are kind of comfortable thinking about choice as being, we have free will and we can choose what we do, and a lot of our behaviours are based on our choices, that is a little bit problematic. So I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that choice is really linked quite closely to things like privilege and opportunity, and the choice environment is not equal. Some things are harder to choose than others, and for some people choices are limited in ways that they aren't for other people. So the whole concept of trying to change people's behaviour and choice, a lot of these approaches and campaigns are very much focused on the individual rather than changing structures in which people operate. If you make the right choice easier, then more people will make the right choice. But if the right choice is actually harder, then a lot of people aren't going to make it. So not only is choice problematic from a kind of conceptual perspective, it's also problematic from a pragmatic perspective. And the image I've used here is build your own compost toilet. So if we're going to think about making a really sensible choice in terms of the way that we live our lives, then the amount of water wasted on conventional flush systems, for example, is really horrific. So if we were going to be really good environmentalists, then we might decide to build a compost toilet because that reduces water use and ticks lots of boxes as an environmental behaviour. However, of course, most of us don't have that option. So even though I am very well educated in environmental lifestyles and my attitude's absolutely there, I've already been convinced of all of these things, this is still not an option for me because of where I live, kind of house I live in, and so some of our choices are really constrained by practical structures of life. If we also just focus on trying to persuade people to just tweak and modify their existing behaviours, then we're not going to address these larger and more significant problems. If we think about the status quo as being something that just needs a bit of modification, then we're not really dealing with the scale of change that's needed. Some of the kinds of ideas and concepts around this are linked to these sort of scenarios and looking at scenarios. So we have the business as usual scenario, which you've probably heard of, and that's kind of where you ask people to maybe not use plastic bags and to try and recycle their drinks bottles, and to think about switching the light switch off before they leave a room, and all those kinds of things. Don't leave things on standby. that's kind of saying basically the structure of your life is okay, we can carry on with that, just try and modify a few things. And in terms of environmental behaviour and consumption of natural resources and energy, that's not actually plausible. We can't do that. That's not a plausible future scenario to be able to just carry on with business as usual. Some people then go down the kind of approach of thinking we've got to kind of return to old-fashioned values where we sort of go back to the way we used to do things back in the old days when it was fine, and kids played in the road and we all bought our food from the local greengrocers and the local butchers. Um, and that's got, there are things to be learned from that, but it's also not, we don't really want to go back, do we? We don't want to go back to a time when we had really high infant mortality and we had people, living until they were in their late 40s because they worked in coal mines. So we also need to think about maybe a more progressive way of moving forward, which is to transition into a new way of living, which maybe borrows some ideas from the past, but also embraces some of the possibilities and the technological knowledge that we have and the scientific knowledge that we have to move forward in a different way. But that's still going to require quite a radical transformation in our everyday norms and expectations around consumption. So this might be, I'll move over here now. This might be quite a familiar kind of domestic setup for those of you that have lived in halls. This is a picture of student halls of residence kitchen. And again, this is another quote from Elizabeth Shove, which says that certain forms of our demand in terms of the way that we, sorry about that, certain forms of demand are unavoidably inscribed, written into the way that we live. For example, in the design and operation of electricity and water infrastructures in the architecture of the home. So when we're talking about this choice and ability to choose differently and live a more environmentally sustainable lifestyle, we're making some assumptions there about how much choice we have. So I mentioned about the composting toilet, and here we have an example where actually if you live in a rented property like that, you don't have a lot of choice about your energy supply. You don't have a lot of choice about how you manage your water, how you manage your domestic waste. So people's choices are very restricted, and therefore focusing just upon persuading people to make better choices is actually very limiting in terms of changing the way that we live and consume. What we also have to ask ourselves, flying up here now, this is exciting, isn't it? Is whether or not we really want to change. So how much do we actually want to, and how scared are we of the prospect of significant change? So if we're going to really think about the scale of change necessary to live more sustainable and harmonious life with nature, then we need to think bigger than behaviours. We need to be actually prepared to disrupt the normal status quo everyday patterns of life and do things very, very differently and start to make plans for doing things very differently now. And that requires starting small, starting now, but also thinking big and having big aspirations for where we're going to go. And I'm borrowing this sort of turn of phrase from Elizabeth Shove again. What we need to start to question, I would argue, is the self-evident necessity of the way that we currently live and the way that we currently consume. And if we're going to start to change the way that we think about consumption, then it's interesting to maybe start to shift away from thinking about behaviour and individual behaviour and thinking more about the structures of everyday life. And some of the terms that we use for that will be to think about practices. So rather than individual behaviour, we think about social practices, which are more collective. So moving from thinking about individuals to more social structures kind of scales up the issue a little bit. We start thinking about the way in which everyday life is organised. So this is moving away, as this quote says, from it's not, behaviours are not based upon individual choice. They're based upon larger socio-cultural, economic and technical transitions that redefine normal. So we have to change what normal life looks like if we're going to change the way that we consume resources. So practice theory, again, I'm not going to go into it in huge amount of detail here. You can go and explore this yourself. It's sociological theory. So these are some of the earlier proponents of the theory. It comes, as I say, from sociology rather than psychology. So psychology is very much based around the individual, and sociology, as the name suggests, is much more about studying the structures of society. So these ideas emerging from sociology kind of make sense. So it looks at the patterns of everyday life and thinks about how those patterns have evolved and changed over time. And these theories are now starting to gain more currency with um, geographers, environmentalists, environmental scientists, but also product designers and policymakers who work with government. And they're taking a lot of interest in those theories and thinking about how we can use some of them to help us think about, conceptualize bigger structural changes to the way we live our lives. And I'm going to look at finally now quickly a case study to try and explain this difference between individual practices and individual behaviours and social practices by looking at a case study around cycling and driving. So if we think about the aim being that we want to reduce the number of car and bus journeys and increase the amount of cycling, and in order we're doing that because we want to have less air pollution and less congestion, so we want to improve the environment. But also the secondary benefits from that would be to improve our health and to also improve road safety. We have more people on bikes and fewer people in vehicles. To think about this in a practice theory way, then what we see is cycling and driving not as choices but as competing practices. So we're looking at two different ways of getting around and thinking about how we shift people from one to another. Because these two practices compete for space and they compete for time and resources. So one of them has, what this is termed from the theory, normative advantage. So one of them is considered the normal way of doing things and the other one isn't. And this has changed over time. So historically, before everyone had cars, cycling was far more normal. And it was considered the normal way of getting about. These days, driving has the normative advantage over cycling. So if we want to change this dynamic and move more people out of cars and onto bikes, then we need to increase the number of people who perform the practice of cycling and get them and win them away from driving. And how do we do this? If we do that just by persuading people to choose cycling, then what we have to do is actually think about what cycling represents as a practice. And if we're going to make sense of that, then one of the ways to do that would be to think about why cycling is considered a problem. What are the barriers? So I am a cyclist in the city, so I can tell you now that these are the barriers. Hills. Somewhere like Sheffield, very, very hilly. It's okay if you're cycling around Amsterdam, but if you're trying to increase the number of people cycling in cities, then you need to think about the hills. People are worried about being sweaty and smelling. So that is another barrier when you ask people why they don't cycle. They're like, I don't want to get to work and sweat and smelly. There's also a problem around storing bikes. So this will follow on from some of the things you may have seen in my YouTube video about sustainable lifestyles. Where do we store our bikes? In normal size houses in places like Sheffield. People are very worried about their personal safety and how safe it feels to ride on the roads, and they're worried about their bikes being stolen. So if we're going to actually improve the number of increase the number of cyclists on the road, these are the kinds of things we need to actually be addressing structurally, rather than just hoping that we can persuade more people to get on a bike. If we start to change, shift that dynamic and get more people out of cars and onto bikes, and we start to get feedbacks and we start to look at a bigger systemic change. So the more people that start to ride bikes, then we start to see what we change to what we call the normative infrastructure. So rather than assuming that cars have dominance on the road, you start to build an infrastructure for cycling, and cycling starts to take priority. And we're starting to see that a little bit more now through some of the COVID measures around the city, and cities like Sheffield have started to improve their cycle infrastructure significantly, often to the disadvantage of car drivers. And another example of that would be the introduction of the congestion charge in London, which really gave people a good reason to get out of their cars and try something different. So the congestion charge kind of came in and interrupted the practice of driving, interrupted the normal way of doing things, and made people examine what they were going to do and try other options. And since that happened, the impetus has been that more and more people have actually started to ride bikes in London. And as that happens, incrementally, the infrastructure improves and it feels like a safer thing to do. But to flip that and look at a completely different approach, rather than incrementally changing, we could look at a German example from the city of Freiburg, where they approach this more radically by banning cars from the central zone, and where you completely get rid of cars from the road. Funnily enough, people ride bikes all the time. It feels safer, and that actually makes sense as the primary way of getting around if the car is no longer an option. So if we think more about this process of shifting people's attitudes, in the UK, there's a gender perspective as well. So in the UK, men, this is a few years old now, but made 72% of all cycling trips. In the Netherlands, they make 45% of cycling trips, and women make up the other percentage. This is important because what the research shows is that women are what we call a good indicator species for overall levels of perceived cycling safety. So the more women you get on bikes, generally speaking, that means that cycling feels like a safer activity, because women are historically tend to be less likely to cycle if they feel like the activity is dangerous. So the more women on the roads is a good indicator that generally more people across the board feel safer riding their bikes. So people choose to drive because not only is it convenient, but it seems often like the only viable option. People buy disposable bottles of water and disposable plastic cups and everything else because it's normal. It's also quite difficult to avoid that kind of practice. People eat meat not because they make bad choices, because it's socially normalized, it's easy, it's affordable, it seems better value. And these are all good examples of how normative ideas about consumption drive people's behavior and choice. It's not that people are constantly making bad choices. This is a normal way of living, and to step outside of a normal way of living is actually really hard work for people. So if we're going to think differently, then we maybe need to adopt a different mindset. And one of the ways we can think about this is transition thinking. So transition thinking historically was about moving away from oil dependency into a renewable energy economy. So, but what's interesting from my perspective about transition thinking as an approach is it's systemic change. It's thinking about incremental systemic change towards a more sustainable way of life. But it recognises that the existing status quo cannot be maintained. The literature around transition also identifies the locus of change, the point of change, further upstream than the individual consumer. So you change the environment in which people make choices, and that has a much bigger impact in terms of environmental behaviour than just persuading people to choose differently at the very end of the process. So behaviour in transition thinking is the outcome of socio-technical change, not the driver of it. So you don't start by trying to change people's behaviour. You change the structures and people's behaviour changes as a result of that change. So in summary, if we think about practices rather than behaviours, we think at a different scale. We think about how we actually have to shape things structurally in order to get people to be able to live different kinds of lives, more environmental lives. It also makes us think about this idea of choice. How much choice do we really have, and how easy is it to make choices? And how sensible and effective is it to keep focusing on persuading people to make better choices? It also makes us think about this idea of structural sticking points. So what is getting in the way of people leading more environmental lives and behaving in more environmentally sustainable ways? We need to tackle the barriers, not just people's attitudes towards their environmental interactions. And there is the references from this week's presentation. Sorry, I've been moving around the screen quite a lot, and I hope you found this useful. Thanks very much.